Thank you, Reed. Ron, alcoholic. I think you all probably knew or intuited that. So because of that really highfalutin introduction, I have to start by saying that I am the kind of guy who, without some kind of intervention, is incapable of not drinking. And when I drink, I lose control of my bodily functions. I have been known to puke most anywhere. I have peed more places than many people have even thought of drinking. And it really gets kind of unpleasant with a lot of that. I share that right off the start just to qualify. My story, the sobriety story began back in December 1985. So I'm 36 years sober. And my home group is in Atlanta, Georgia. There is a solution group. But I start with that leveling qualification that I'm not here because of all those credentials. I'm here because left to my own devices, I train wreck my life. And I know that's the thing that we have in common. And my sponsor always said, hey, get real, start with the real stuff so that people know you're a real alcoholic. Big shout out to the Pavillon, Reed, others. Thanks for giving me a chance to do this kind of work. The couple of people who are here tonight have actually been in some of the workshops around strengths that I started doing a while back. And it has become increasingly a part of the things that I practice in recovery with people in recovery. So I'm going to tell you a little bit about that tonight. But I want to start really by cutting to the chase. And the chase is that I know, even if you don't, that each of you have some magic in you. Each of you has a set of strengths, talents, aptitudes that really can be quite remarkable. You may not know you have those, which is pretty common. But I know you have them, and I'm going to tell you how it is I know that you have that sweet spot. We know definitively now that every human being, which includes every one of us alcoholics and addicts, by the age of 5 to 7, has practiced certain ways of being that have become incredibly effective. It's some strange mix of nature and nurture, as those people say. What that means, let me translate that. That means that you showed up on planet Earth with a genetic set. Here's the roulette of the universe, the delegation from God, the heritage that came from your family, your parents. You came with a genetic code, and you were immediately dropped into some environment. In most of our cases, it wasn't necessarily a healthy environment, but it was what it was with the people that were there, the culture you were exposed to, the places you happened to be. And by the age of 5 to 7, that strange mix of your genes and your circumstances had been deeply reinforced in you. And you became really, really anomalously good at those ways of being. Now, the big book language I want to play with for a second is, there's that line in We Agnostics that I'm going to modify a little bit. These strengths may be deep down inside you. They may be obscured by any number of things, including addiction and alcoholism, but rest assured, somewhere within you, they are there. And I say that with that kind of clarity because professionally, I do this work all the time with people, and it's well validated, and I've decided we need to bring it into recovery, part of what I call progressive recovery, which I'll say a little bit more as we go. This stuff all came, interestingly enough, just a little bit of a backstory here, out of a researcher by the name of Malcolm Gladwell. Some of you may have read some of his books. And Gladwell at one point found out that almost every Canadian hockey player, professional, had been born in January or February. And he said, well, that's really strange. I wonder why that could be. So he did the research, and it turned out that the kids who were born in January or February were the oldest in their age cohort. So when they put skates on them at the age of 2.5, as they do in Canada, those kids were 10 months older than their peers. And the result was that over the ensuing years, they got all the playing time, all the extra practice time, all the mentoring, and all the coaching. So it wasn't just that they were older, it was that they got it reinforced over and over and over and over and over again, which is why many parents hold their children back a year, because 10 months is developmentally a big gap. So what we know about you is that you got dropped here on planet Earth with these incredible things that would get developed in you. There's some interesting other research I want to share. And I do this because many of you, like me, have found yourself in the position of thinking there's something wrong with you. And I'm going to talk a little bit about that in a minute, about the part of the program that looks for our character defects and so forth. But the research that I refer to is that 90% of people in workplaces and settings who are having a difficult time are not problem people. They are people who are in the wrong setting. We talk a lot about fit. So think about that for a minute. If you've been unhappy in a job, unhappy in a relationship, unhappy in some community, unhappy in some field of play, there's a 90% probability that it's not something wrong with us. It's that we are not well suited to the setting we find ourselves in. That is like a really huge thing for us, because we're so convinced there's something wrong with us and that that's the whole story of us. But it's not, and the research backs it up. So there's like this incredibly complex thing we got to tease out, like, where do we go with character defects as opposed to strengths? And I promise I'm going to get there. But I wanted to start with that because it's a remarkable idea that there's a 90% probability that if we're struggling, we're just not planted in the right soil. That, as I say, is a huge implication for us. Now, here's the problem we face. Assuming you believe that there's strengths in you, either you can't see them. Entirely a possibility because of what the big book calls old ideas. Let's say hypothetically that you have been told as a result of your family of origin that you're a lousy, rotten, no good so-and-so. Let's assume that it was done 10,000 times, 50,000 times, whatever the number was, early in your life and continuing. What that means is you have an old idea, it's right out of the big book, an old idea that there's something wrong with you. And the result is that even if there was a great character trait, you might have a very difficult time seeing it. This happens all the time. You all have probably had this experience. Assuming you've been in Pavillon or therapy or group therapy, you'll know that there are these moments where someone looks at you and says, man, you're just great. And you're like, oh, no, don't. No, let me tell you about all my character defects. Because we can't stand the possibility of seeing that there's something right in us. Or it may be so inconsistent with what we believe about ourselves, we have to reject it. That's big stuff for us because we've been so acclimated to rejecting that stuff. It could be that you, like I, have spent so much time looking at what's wrong with you that the fact that anything might be right with you is really kind of viewed to be impossible. It's one of the challenges in recovery. And again, I'm going to talk about how we balance this stuff out, is that we spend a lot of time looking at what's wrong with us. And we need to. I'm not going to say that's not appropriate. But we are more than a collection of things that are wrong with us. Rest assured, and I'm going to give you some example of that in just a moment. It could also be that we just don't understand these strengths, these talents, these aptitudes. Now, I have a friend named Al here in Atlanta who has been known to say, when we get into inventory type meetings, 4th step, 5th step, 10th step meetings, he's been known to say that oftentimes our character assets are the flip side of our character defects. Or change that, our character defects are the flip side of our character assets. Kind of like the language in the 12 and 12 and in the big book that talks about our instincts gone awry. You know, something goes off the rails, and it's much more complicated than that. So let me give you some real world examples of this from people I've worked with this in recovery. Let me tell you about Alicia. When Alicia did her first inventory, one of the things that stood out was that she was, by her own admission and by lots of data from people around her, was a busybody and a control freak. Now, I'm sure that doesn't apply to any of you, but it's fairly common language in the rooms. Well, there was evidence that that was true, but what she couldn't see was that the reason she was a busybody and a control freak was that she felt so very responsible for so many things that she had been warped by her circumstances. So in fact, when we peeled away the dysfunction, the stuff that wasn't working for her, what we found was someone who was deeply responsible and deeply accountable. So much so that it presented its own problems because she felt responsible for things that weren't hers to feel responsible for. And that's actually why she started in drinking and drugging in the first place. It was too hard for her to feel so responsible. So her escape became alcohol and drugs. And the flip side of that remarkable responsibility, that's a value, that's a strength, that's an asset. We even have it in that language in AA. Whenever anyone anywhere reaches out for the hand of AA, I want the hand of AA always to be there, and for that I am responsible. It's the responsibility statement. We value responsibility, and Alicia had a huge amount of it, but it was showing up as being a busybody and being a control freak. So all of a sudden you go, wow, that's like totally not what I thought. Let me give you another example. Me. I caught so much grief early in recovery for thinking too much, having too many ideas, asking too many questions. I was told that I needed to take the cotton out of my ears and stick it in my mouth, which is actually an abusive thing to tell someone. I was lucky. I had a really good sponsor who said to me one day, he said, Ron, you got born with a really good brain. We are powerless over getting your brain to stop working. You are as powerless over your brain as you are drinking. So let's just stop thinking that somehow or another you're going to alter that good brain of yours. Instead, let's start thinking about how we're going to harness that good thinker of yours and turn it into the wonderful gift it actually is. And first, we're going to have to take some stuff out of your thinking because it's pretty problematic as part of the whole sobriety process, right? But then he told me that one day that brain that I was being criticized for would be a great and practical gift. And indeed, a big part of that high-end introduction that Reed gave for me about that work that I do, a lot of it is because I figured out how to use this incredible brain that still sometimes goes into overload and overthinks and spins out. So the overthinking, the overanalyzing, the overquestioning was the dysfunctional side of what was actually a great asset that I could not see because I was so ashamed of this brain I couldn't control. That's a common story in the rooms. There's a lot of people with good brains who've been shamed into thinking there's something wrong with that. Let me tell you about Karen. Her inventory was labeled as too sensitive too depressive, too emotionally wrought? Well, it turns out that she is probably, when we look at it in terms of how we analyze strengths or assets, she is very high in empathy, off the charts high in empathy. Empathy is an incredible asset. It allows for compassion. It allows for consideration. It allows for thoughtfulness. It allows for the ability to listen well to people. And because of how she got warped with that, it ran off the rails and she became, depressive, overwrought. One of the most interesting things about Karen's story was when and this was after she got sober, Karen found her way to a different workplace. And I know this is only one person, but I love one person good stories just like you do. Karen, for the first time in her adult life, when she finally found a place that was positive and nurturing in which to work, she came off antidepressants for the first time as an adult and has stayed off of them for 8 or 9 years now. So it turns out that her depressive tendencies were because she was incredibly empathetic, a product of how she got born and what she got born into. And that when it went off the rails, she became this overwrought depressive. And crazily enough, the way this stuff works, she kept finding herself in places that would damage her. So we picked her up, took her out of that soil, which was not good soil for her, put her in some other soil where she was nurtured and her empathy was valued. And at last count, not only is she off antidepressants, she has been in that job for 12 years now and is doing extraordinarily well. So these are the stories of the flip side of these things we call character defects. Instincts run awry. And they are often the flip side of character assets, things that we can't see, can't own, don't understand, reject, whatever. So I want to stop for a minute and reflect on that. If it's true that 90% of people who aren't doing well are in the wrong setting, they're just in the wrong soil, if that's true, and the research is good on that, and if it's true that oftentimes the things we are struggling with are in fact the flip side of some character assets, some strengths, some talents, some remarkable capabilities, it introduces a whole different kind of inventory for us. No longer do we start looking for what's wrong with us. We start inquiring, well, then what's not aligned right? If you want to put this in the relational context, I know lots of us have relational breakdowns. Well, if you look at a lot of our relational stories, and this is my story, somehow or another, we keep finding our way to the same kinds of people. They look different, they seem different, but then we play out the same pattern over and over and over and over and over and over again. And at some moment, you have to stop and ask yourself, well, is that because something's wrong with me? Maybe, that's probably part of the equation. But I have a different question to ask. How is it I keep finding my way to places that don't seem to be good for me? Maybe that's at the root of why we have to find different playmates and different playgrounds when we get sober, because some of the ones we're attracted to are deeply damaging and reinforce the character defect side of this strange coin that has character assets on the other side. What if I was right where I started? What if every one of you has a magic place inside you? What if it was installed there as a consequence of your birth, your heritage genetically, and of the circumstances you found yourself in, and it's just obscured? You just can't see it. You can't own it. You can't figure it out. You don't even know it's there. Suddenly, we're no longer problem people as we often think we are. We're people who don't even know ourselves well. And we're probably people who have found our way to places that consistently reinforce things that are only a very small part of the story. So having said that, I want to go back to basics for a moment, because I talked earlier about the challenges with, looking at our character defects. And there is a context for this. I want to go back to real solid AA for a minute. Here's the basics. The first thing we do is we do anything we can to put alcohol and drugs down, because defects or character assets is really kind of a moot point, a question, a conversation we can't have as long as we're drinking and drugging. And so the number one thing we always hear is, see if you can not drink today. Ground zero. Don't drink. Don't drug. See if you can get yourself to a meeting. See if you can get plugged in. The next thing that usually comes around is we're told to clean up the crap in our lives. There's some really good reasons for this. And hopefully we're told the way you clean up the crap in your life is not by, I just heard this in a meeting yesterday, osmosis, sitting in a meeting and talking. Instead, hopefully we're told that the steps, the 12 steps, will clean the crap up. Now, the crap is everything from our indebtedness to our bad behavior, our unemployability, the relationships we've failed with. But more importantly, the reason we start with that, I mean, not more importantly, one of the big reasons we start with that is that for most of us, guilt and shame runs very, very, very deep in us, especially because we have done, in many cases, a lot of things that didn't work very well, harmed others, etc. And also because we've been told over and over again, there's something wrong with us, we're bad human beings, etc. So we start with cleaning stuff up. My longtime sponsor, Sam, used to say that one of the most powerful things about the steps and the rooms is that they allow us to start doing anything that moves us in the right direction, which lets us feel good about ourselves, for many of us, for the first time in a very long time. That simple act of the proverbial cleaning up ashtrays, making the coffee, cleaning up coffee cups, cleaning up the parking lot. All that stuff is an asset building step in the right direction to help us stop feeling so badly about ourselves. I hope you all know this. And if you don't, you need to know this. Guilt and shame will lead you back to a drink. Happens all the time. And yet a lot of us really believe that guilt and shame is actually beneficial. There's not a lot of evidence to support that in my recovery. It's a good indicator, but not necessarily helpful. So our first time through the steps, our early recovery is going to be to clean the crap up. We absolutely got to do that. That stuff will work you over and probably send you back out. So that's where we start with the steps. We're not ready for talking about strengths yet. We need to clean up the crap. Our next iteration through the steps is going to ask us to go deeper. And this is the realm of my progressive recovery approach, the book, the website, all of that. What progressive recovery basically says, and there's other ways to do this, mine is just progressive recovery. You can do this in a really good advanced AA group. You can do this in a really good book study, a really good group study. We're asked to go deeper because it turns out the big book gives us some hints about what stands in our way. Those hints are two, and then there's a third Bill Wilson added to it. The first hint we're given is that we're going to try and get down to causes and conditions. What I often say about this, and I often annoy people with it, is AA is not a behavior improvement program. If behavior improvement was the solution, none of us would need the program. We would have improved our behavior long ago. AA is a psychic transformation program. So what we're looking at here with this idea of behavioral improvement, sure, I mean, if you can stop being a jerk, stop being a jerk. You know, if you can improve your conduct to your loved ones, great, improve your conduct. If, like me, you find that a lot of that is beyond you, then you're going to have to get down to causes and conditions. And really, column 4 of the 4th step, there are 4 columns, 4th step, the person or the situation, what happened, how it affected us, and what our part was. Well, over in column 4, what our part was is where we get to start looking more deeply. Because if I were to poll you all, I'm going to bet you in the past couple of weeks, all of you managed to do something stupid or injure somebody, because we're human beings, we do that. If I were also going to ask you whether or not you started that day with the intention of doing something stupid or harming someone, the answer would be, of course not. If I asked you all to go back in your life about whether or not you planned on train wrecking your life, you would say, of course not. I was doing the best I could. I just ended up train wrecked. So when we start looking at this, we see that there's something more going on. And Bill Wilson and the writers of the big book called that causes and conditions. We're trying to get a look at, where does this stuff come from? Causes and conditions. A lot of that takes us back to old ideas. I use an example of a guy I worked with a few years ago now, really big guy, played football, really, big guy, strong guy, college football. And he had endured a terrible childhood of pretty dramatic abuse. And some of the work we had to do involved digging deep in him to understand the part of him that could never feel safe. So here is a big guy, played football, can take care of himself. But if you did certain things, you could see terror in his eyes. See, if he believes he's not safe, there's a whole bunch of stuff that happens, and that was literally beaten into him. That's causes and conditions, old ideas. Another thing the big book encourages to look at is decisions based on self that have placed us in a position to be harmed. Sometimes that's present tense decisions. Some of them go back a long way in time. Looking for decisions based on self. For example, at some point long ago in my life, I decided that being important would solve my terrible, terrible human problems. So one of the things that drove me to a lot of what I have managed to succeed at was the need to be important. Well, eventually people won't let you be important, or you'll screw up, or things will be taken from you, or your life will crash. And suddenly you'll come face to face with this deep, dark night of the soul, where you realize that being important doesn't work. That's a psychic transformation space. That's like 7-step space. A third thing Bill urged us to do in going deeper comes out of a letter he wrote at the time he wrote The Next Frontier, which is the letter is known for emotional sobriety, where he talks about the crippling dependencies which set us up for being injured. At the same time that he wrote about that, he wrote in a letter that the purpose of the moral inventory was to find out how we were damaged by life. To find out how we were damaged by life. So here's Bill, 20 plus years into recovery. And he's no longer talking about the inventory being something where we add up our bad behaviors. He's moved completely away from that and is saying we're trying to understand how we were damaged. And then he goes on to say, because if we can get a look at it, we can get the ground glass out of that and we will be better for it. So this idea of going deeper, there's all kinds of ways we can do that. Some of us need therapy. My longtime sponsor, Sam, said the passage he most often saw people blowing past in the big book was the one that said, seek out professional help if you need it. Because we don't really want to do that. But I got 25 years of good therapy under my belt, and it has served me very, very well, as has a sponsor, as has 12 steps, as has spiritual advisors. So let me revisit this. We start by figuring out a way to stop drinking and drugging. Then our first time through the steps is to clean up the crap, because there's a lot of guilt, a lot of shame, a lot of misconduct, a lot of broken stuff that needs to be mended. And that is a great place to start. At some point, most of us find that we have to go more deeply into the inventory work, the step work. We have to practice more deeply. More will be revealed. In fact, one of my favorite lines that I don't remember where this came from, but I loved it. The sign of a good program is it should always be revealing you the next layer of inner work that you need. which was like a radical new idea to me. See, I thought the point of a program was to reach a place of relative ease and comfort so I would never be disturbed again. In fact, it turns out good step work gives us the next reason to be disturbed so that we can clean up one more part of whatever is not right within us. Then we have an opportunity to lean into this strengths inventory. Now, I could argue that you might be able to do strengths inventory after that first round of steps before you do the deeper dive. That would actually probably be fine. But the main point I'm trying to make, because of what I said earlier, is it would be foolhardy to come in and just only look at the things that are good about us without also looking at the places that we're train wrecked, including the drinking and drugging that may still be going on. So we got to start in that direction. If we can bring strengths in earlier, that's a great thing. I want to share something interesting about this. And I'm going to use myself as an example. I am an extraordinarily good learner. I also have been known to hide out in books and hide out in libraries and escape conflict by reading books. I love to learn. It's like one of those things. Well, there's a reason why I love to learn. Part of it was I got that good brain. That's genes. I don't get to claim any credit for the good brain. But the additional part of the story, here's this strange thing that happens to us in this development that we go through. I was dropped into a family that had a fair share of dysfunction, like many of you. There was active alcoholism, and there was a long history of alcoholism and drug addiction in my family system. Well, here's the beauty of that. When you're dropped into dysfunction, learning is a survival strategy. So I got a brain that liked to learn. I was dropped into a dysfunctional family. And by the way, they're good people. I mean, I always have to say that because it's like, I'm not criticizing anyone, and I would never want my family members to hear that I'm criticizing my family. They're good people, and there was some dysfunction. And one consequence of that dysfunction, amazingly enough, was to reinforce my learning capacity. There's that strange flip side of the coin again. Now, on top of that, my dad and mom came out of Dust Bowl, Oklahoma. Poverty, extreme poverty. And they learned that learning and education would get you a better life. So I grew up being immersed in a family culture where learning and education is desirable, very desirable. It's expected of you. So here I am, I'm this impressionable little kid, dropped into a dysfunctional family system where learning's a good thing with a good brain that emphasizes learning and a whole culture around me that says, learn, 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 educate, 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 educate. And the result is my highest strength when we test these things is as a learner. Everywhere I go, I learn. Now, here's what's funny about what we've learned about strengths and that whole thing about being in the right soil. If you put me someplace where I can't learn, I don't last. If you put me someplace where I can't learn, I don't last. Learning is true to my nature. It's who I am. I once had a janitorial job before I stopped drinking because I needed money. And I made all these improvements in it. I found ways to improve things. And after 3 weeks, the big boss came in and told me to not make any changes. It was exactly an 8-hour job designed to be delivered in exactly 8 hours without any steps being changed. It was a rote job and he knew better and I should just follow directions and I would be fired if I deviated. I quit because I couldn't stand the possibility that I couldn't learn and improve upon the process. Every time my learner has been stifled. So let me say something about this idea of strengths. Here's what we know. And there's really good research on this. I keep saying that. This ain't just stuff I'm making up. It turns out that when you are in your happy place, when you're thriving and content and fruitful, and people are happy with what you're doing, you are probably in your strengths. Conversely, if you're not thriving, you're not flourishing, you're not bearing fruit, you're struggling, you're probably not in your strengths. And I'll tell you a story about that here in a moment that actually is kind of my story. But one thing I want to do before I go into a little bit of the wrap up, which we're headed towards, There's a commercial product. I make no money off of this. I use it everywhere. I use it with people in recovery. I use it with professional clients. There's a product, and I will drop the links to these into the chat box after I get done yammering here. The book is called StrengthsFinder 2.0. It's like a $20 book. StrengthsFinder 2.0, you can find it in any bookstore. You can find it online. If you don't want a book, there's a product called Clifton Top 5 Strengths, which is available at a website, gallup.com. I will drop these links in there. It's like 19 bucks. So the reason these are so useful is because these are the guys who figured out the science behind understanding your strengths. They'll literally appraise your strengths. They'll give you an assessment report you can begin to learn from. And at some point, as we move through these sessions, I'm going to talk more about that. So first of all, if you decide you want to do that, you can get the book, or you can go to the website. You can buy the book, go on the website, get your assessment results. It will begin to tell you a little bit about this piece of you that you may not understand or be able to see, which is really great. You know that line in the big book that says God will constantly reveal more to us? Well, you know, if God wants to reveal it through an assessment tool I can buy for 17 bucks, I'm all in. I'm perfectly happy with God working through commercial products. And what I've learned over the years, I've done these assessments and worked with probably 4,000 people on this. So it's pretty effective. Okay, enough on that. I'm not trying to sell the book. If you decide not to do that, we're still going to talk about those things. You can decide to do whatever you want to do because it is your own free world. So let me tell you a little bit about where we're going with this. But first, let me summarize. We do have to look at what's wrong with us. Character defects, maladaptions, the ways we got warped. We have to look at that. That's part of the cleanup work. We also are probably going to need to find out what happened to us. That's the line Bill gave us about how we were damaged by life. And there's all kinds of things we can learn about ourselves there. Again, because pretty much every baby is born pretty contented and pretty happy to have a life, and something happens along the way. And there's actually a whole nother, I think it was a book that was written. I just happened to see this on Oprah one time that said, we need to stop asking what's wrong with us and start asking what happened to us. Because that's part of the story. It's part of the causes and conditions, and we need to get curious about that. Let me say a word about that, because I have been shamed in recovery around that, where I would start talking about what happened, and someone would say, you know, this ain't about blaming your mama. Well, I'm not blaming my mama. I'm acknowledging that there were some deficient things in my upbringing. She's not to blame. She delivered it as well as she could, just like my dad did, just like my sister. They were doing the best they knew how. But that doesn't mean I got what I needed when I was growing up. Both of those are true. So there's both what's quote unquote wrong with me, and there's what happened to me. And then I'm going to suggest, and this is a provocative piece of language that I really like, I want you to start asking yourself, what's right with me? What's not just wrong with me? Not what happened to me, not just those, but what's right with me? When have I been at my best? When have I flourished? When have I been fruitful? When have people been really happy with how I show up? What are the circumstances? What's the soil that I'm in when I am bearing fruit richly, as the saying goes? Because there's a story there. And I'm going to go so far as to suggest that part of this learning about our strengths, our talents, our aptitudes, the magic within us is going to be because what you're going to see is the places that you thrive, the places that you're happy, that you're fruitful, you're probably in your strengths. And the places where you're struggling, unhappy, etc., you're probably not in your strengths. The research would suggest that when you're in your strengths, that's what happens. And when you're out of your strengths, that's what happens. And so getting into your strengths is a really, really good strategy. So let me tell you a little bit about what's upcoming, because I know there's a session next week. And this was sort of the foundation. Next week, we're actually going to go into step work and start looking at how this might apply. And if you happen to have done strengths assessments between now and next week, that's great. And if you don't, that's fine too. We're going to start talking about how to apply the steps in a way that's different, because the principles in the steps help illuminate things. And I'm proposing that you need to be as illuminated about what's right in you as you have spent so much time trying to eliminate what is wrong in you and what happened to you. I really want you to do all three of these, because I think they're much more of the story that we mostly want to be able to see. So let me tell you something funny that happened to me that's very relatable to me. I was out walking in my neighborhood here in North Decatur, Georgia, suburb of Atlanta. I go out and I walk pretty regularly. Part of my wanderlust that we were laughing about before the meeting started. I just don't stay still very well. And I walked around this corner, and I guess I should preface this by saying I lived for a long, long time in the state of New Mexico, which is high desert with lots of desert plants. And I turned this corner here in red clay, humid down south Georgia, and I saw that someone had dug out part of their front yard and had planted a cactus garden, which told me that they'd put layers of sediment in there that would drain the soil. But I also know cactus well enough from having lived in the desert for a long time to know that those cactus weren't doing great. They weren't dead, right? So whatever they'd done to get the soil to drain and everything had allowed them to live, but they were not flourishing. They were not blossoming. They were not in great soil. And that's partly because beneath the sediment that they put in there, there was still Georgia red clay, and it was still a humid climate, and that's just not cactus country. So here's the cool deal. If I took that exact same cactus plot and I dropped a helicopter cargo net over it, and I lifted it up, sediment and all, and transported it out to central New Mexico or central Arizona, where there's a little bit of elevation, and I dropped that very same cactus plants into that soil in New Mexico or Arizona, within a matter of 18 months, 2 years at the longest, they would be thriving, blossoming, and flourishing. And they would be exactly the same cactus that were here in Georgia. All we would have done was take them and put them in soil that was appropriate to them. Now, the reason I like that story is because I like to compare myself to a cactus, which I think is kind of funny, actually. You know, I've been known to be prickly and sharp and all those sorts of things. And so I love comparing the idea that if you take me and my cactusness and you put me in a place where there is the right kind of soil and environment, I bear blossoms and fruit as a cactus. It doesn't suggest that I don't have prickly parts. It suggests that I will flourish as the cactus that I am because I've been put in the soil that will allow me to bear fruit. That's like so accurate and true for me. And I'm going to take a little further. The better and better the soil I found myself in as a result of recovering the 12 steps, this is like really remarkable to me. The less and less prickly I've become and the more fruit I've borne. My cactus nature has been altered through this process by better and better soil. And some of that soil is like people like you. I'm surrounded by people now who are part of a different soil. They're part of a different world. That's important because of a story a guy named Bill told me, not that Bill, another Bill, who told me one day after a meeting. He was about 20 years sober. And he said, Ron, I'm just not coming back to AA anymore. And I said, what's up with that, Bill? And he said, well, I found out I'm not just a bad person and a broken person and a tragic alcoholic. And all I hear in AA is about what's wrong with me and how I'm screwed up. And that the problem is, if I'd stop being screwed up, I wouldn't be a problem. He said, I can't do that anymore. I'm not that guy anymore. And I told my story at a conference in Virginia Beach a few years ago, where that's what I talk mostly about, is what it's like to be made whole, to be made well. to be a human being who happens to be psychologically and emotionally healthy, which is what the steps are designed to do. So suddenly my cactusness is seen to be being altered within me. And I just love the vision of cactus, and I love beautiful flowering cacti. And so I share that with you. Sometimes I think what we ought to say about the seventh step is not that our character defects are removed. Maybe they're altered. Maybe the seventh step is about altering our relationship to ourselves, about seeing ourselves differently, about understanding that we're not the damaged package of goods we thought we were, that we're not the failures we sometimes think we are, we're not the imposters we sometimes think we are. Imposter syndrome is fairly common. We're not as lost as we think we are, but we've got to start looking at some things in a different way. We got to start looking at ourselves in a different way. So I'm not rejecting what happens in the rooms of AA. I'm suggesting we add to that. And again, just to summarize, and then we're going to see what things you all might like to talk about. Yes, we're going to have to look at what's wrong with us. Yes, we're going to have to look at what happened to us. And yes, we need desperately to look at what's right with us. That starts to become a full picture of ourselves. And that's something we can stay sober with for a long time to come. I'm looking forward to talking more about how we use the steps next week. Please come back for that. If you're listening on video, you're watching this on the website, great. Come back and join us next week. Reed, I'm going to stop talking and see what folks have to say. Thanks, everyone, for listening and being so attentive. Yeah, if we put this all in the realm of what is broadly called positive psychology, it turns out that, yes, indeed, there's this whole body of knowledge that that adds up to seeing ourselves in a different light. And by the way, it turns out, you may already know this, we respond far better from a chemical brain point of view to positive than negative. Actually, we get a whole positive cascade of uplifting brain chemicals from positivity and seeing ourselves through the lens of getting things right. So yeah, there's a big body of work out there. And all I'm really trying to do is to bring just a very small part of it into the rooms of recovery because, well, for me, it's been valuable. And every time I teach a workshop on this, people tell me, wow, I need to know this stuff. This is an important piece of my recovery. So, the two, I just dropped the link to the book into chat. Let me go pull the link down for the website where you can take the assessment. Takes me a moment to get back and forth. And this is the website. There we go. So that's where the resources are. Again, I don't make a dime off of those. I just use them as a tool to help people understand themselves better. Okay, I'll stop talking and see what questions people have. Yeah, cool. Well, there's like some really cool stuff in here. The first thing I want to tell you is you're right. There's a place for you. And if you're like most of us, you got lost early in your life, probably in childhood, and never figured it out because of all this stuff, and then alcohol and drugs and whatever else. So a couple things to say about that. One of the things that I got advice on very, very early in recovery was to go out and try things that made me uncomfortable. And the reason they encouraged me to do that was not so I would drink, because I was pretty solidly sober, but because there's a whole big world out there I don't know anything about. And the only way to find out is to go try it. And the amazing thing is, stuff that makes me uncomfortable because it's not familiar to me. So it's like, wow, what an amazing concept that part of recovery is a launching pad. The point is, go out there and figure out what's possible for us. Another piece, though, that I'm very curious about because of something you said, which I would actually do an inventory on. I have done inventories on this. When you said, I've always just taken what's come to me, oftentimes what we find is that there's there's a set of old ideas somewhere in us about not deserving or about not feeling adequate, or feeling like there's something wrong with us because we can't figure it out. And so we start settling for things. And it starts becoming a life pattern for some of us. And I've worked with a number of people that has been a piece of it. And now, just because you did this, I'm gonna like kind of go off the charts. Reed, you're gonna laugh because you know how I am. Part of the study I've been doing now is called the 3 halves of life study. And it turns out that the first 50 years of life are us just trying to figure out who we are and get our feet on the ground. And then from 50 to 65, which is called the second half of life, we're supposed to figure out what to do with ourselves. We become these remarkable people with all kinds of talents or skills or experience or whatever. Like, what am I going to do with that? And then this is the part okay, so this is the part I'm embarrassed to talk about because it's like way off the charts. Then there's the third half of life that starts at about 65, which is called the soul's journey home, which is where we fulfill our most important soul's purpose. And we only now know this because we have enough people living long enough to know that the best decade of our lives is in the 60s and 70s, which is unbelievable. I believe recovery is a launching pad. I do not believe that recovery was designed for us to find a comfortable place to hang out and not be threatened or challenged and don't ever grow anymore because we found our little happy place sitting on a convenient, easy chair, drinking knee-high grape soda. That's like all of my experience in recovery is that we were designed to grow and to thrive, and it's a launching pad. The challenge is a lot of us have a lot of old ideas that we shouldn't aspire, that we shouldn't have any hopes, that there's something wrong with us, all that sort of stuff. And that's just not my experience in recovery. Yeah, Bill Wilson wrote a fair amount about how lots of us have a lot of talent, that we are, I don't know if he actually used this language, that lots of us really are above average. And that's not something we talk about very much. We spend much of our time talking about, what screw ups we are. And then we trot out all the evidence of our lives to prove what screw ups we are. But I think there's a whole lot more that's right in us than we're able to lay hands upon and understand.